Thank you for coming out today. My mic's good. We can all hear. Okay, good. Lovely rainy day in Margate with this amazing view behind us. We decided not to do any slides because that's really, art enough. I'm so pleased to be here because I'm such a fan of Flavia's work, and having just taken a little guided tour of the exhibition, I'm just even more in awe of her than I was before. I hope you've all had a chance to see it just now, or maybe some of you are waiting to see it after, or maybe you're doing a little back and forth before and after thing. But yeah, it's really such a terrific show, and so I'm really looking forward to what Flavia has to say about it. So I guess my first question is just like, how did this come about? What's the source for the inspiration for this show?
On a practical level, the show came about when Clary Wallace, who's sitting here in the front row, took over the directorship of Turner, and she invited me to think, imagine. And she was wonderful because she basically gave me carte blanche to imagine a show that was going to bring together women during the post-war moment. And I tend to do a lot of work in that era, 1950s and 60s. And the question I sort of immediately asked myself is, how do I make a show about women where it doesn't become one of those sort of like ghettoizing experiences where women are pigeonholed, but more it's about considering how the experience of these women informed the art they were making at that specific point in time. And that's why for me it was very important. It was around the 1950s and 60s, which was right before the sort of crystallization of feminism in art.
Mm-hmm. So where's your starting point? Who are you looking to kind of translate these ideas to the wall?
Very good point.
Or the center of the room.
Because it's...
Or the ceiling.
Yeah, exactly. It's the ceiling. It's the ceiling where it all started. Because, you can have an idea, but then as a curator, you need to find a way of exploring it and, making it accessible in a visual way through objects. And the one work that I knew very well from my time at Tate was this work by Marisa Merz. It's the one that you see in the last room, and it's a very large hanging piece from the ceiling. It's almost like a seaweed monster made of aluminium. And that work for me was one that captured so many things, in the sense that it's a work that she made at a time when she was looking after a very young child, didn't have a studio or a space of her own, if we want to borrow sort of Virginia Woolf, a room of one's own. And she basically had to make work in and around these sort of life conditions. And in a very methodical way, she would sit there day in and day out with these fine strips of aluminium and staple one after the other, which is an incredibly methodical and laborious process. But she was working from her kitchen table, and in the evening she needed to have dinner with her family on that kitchen table, and so would store the work on the ceiling. She would hang it, and that's the reason why it's a hanging piece. The condition, the context in which she was working determined in many ways the form of the work. And the work still retains its domestic nature. It's quite grimy, and there's the grease of Marisa Merz's kitchen is part of the work, and it cannot be removed at any point in time for any reason. It is the work.
I love there's this grimy kind of oily thing out there. I think that goes against the idea that we might tend to have about late 20th century contemporary sculpture or minimalism, that it might be kind of very clean and precise and definitely not covered with the grease from someone's cooking.
I can't imagine Donald Judd liking grease on his sculptures. So definitely not.
Yeah.
And, yes, precisely. A lot of the work that you see upstairs has... it's not necessarily always coming out of this domestic sphere, but it comes out of a sphere of being handmade. It retains that element. It's very much, even the minimalist works that are in the show, like, Agnes Martin, every single fine line is drawn by hand. None of it is handed over to someone else or handed over to industrial means of construction. And that, to me, was also part of what became very interesting as I started researching the show. It was the labor, the conditions of making, that kind of also became part of the larger sort of discourse of what I was looking at, and the question around abstraction that kept nagging me is, can we see, is there more to abstraction than just the form? And that's why the title is Beyond Form.
Right. So where do we go beyond form? What lies beyond form?
Lots lies beyond form. I mean, we can be here 5 hours discussing what lies beyond form, but we only have 40 minutes. I think it was looking at those intersections, those points of tension where form is almost like a conduit for something other. So, for instance, one of the works you see upstairs in the first room, as you walk in, there are these chains that are hanging. And they're made by the Polish artist Maria Teresa Choisnaka, who, like many Polish artists from her generation, was actually using, quite strategically, I would say, the decorative arts. So something like textiles. In her case, she was making these chains one by hand, made out of sisal. And it's basically, at a time, and she was working in Poland, behind the Iron Curtain, where artists were essentially being asked to work according to very strict socialist realist parameters if you were making painting or sculpture. But if you were making textiles, it was like a lot of freedom suddenly, because it was feminine, it was craft, it was decorative, it was considered minor. But within that sort of area of minority, it was where greater freedom lied, and that's why you have such extraordinary artists. And so she took that and made a work that was incredibly ambitious. It was like immersive. Now we're so used to installation art. That was the beginning of thinking of something on a much larger scale.
When you say immersive, I love the fact that you said when it came out of the crate, it had this like stench to it. Like the sisal is like organic material, and it has its own kind of olfactory presence. It's maybe not part of the work now because it's been airing out, but I like that that kind of confronted you when you received it.
Yeah, and that's the beauty in a way of, I mean, clearly as a curator, don't get me wrong, it's very important to preserve and conserve the works in the right way, but it's also, there's a beauty sometimes to that effect of a work not having been shown ever really, and retaining its original sort of perfume,
exactly.
odor. It's very strong, and I don't encourage people to necessarily go up close and smell it. I think, it's faded away in a month, but it speaks to the story of that work, which maybe doesn't come across necessarily when you walk into a show, because you're seeing it on a kick plinth, you're seeing it in a very different condition.
Yeah.
But a lot of these works were not exhibited, were never seen, not only in this country, but also in their country of making.
I find that really interesting. I mean, it felt like when we were just walking through just now, every other piece would be like, oh, that one's never been shown. That one's been in a box for 50 years. There's this real sense with this show of discovery, not of like, okay, another show about women and abstraction, and okay, here's some Louise Bourgeois. But like, it feels like you really are covering ground that was obscured or kind of uncovering ground that was obscured for a long time.
I mean, that as a curator is a really fun bit.
Yeah.
It's almost like the detective work.
Yeah.
When you start with something like this that you need to have a set of core artists that are perhaps better known. But then within that, the real excitement comes when you can start really thinking in a much more inclusive way, and you go down these rabbit holes, and for every work up there's a story. It was either someone who pointed me in that direction, and in this sense, curating is never just about one individual. It's a very collaborative process always. But it was also like the excitement of saying, oh, let me show again, someone like Barbara Hepworth in the same room as someone like Habouba Farah, Lebanese Brazilian, and Margaret Bennion, British, but, never exhibited. So, you get a real kick out of that. And it's the fun bit. But then in parallel, and I always say this, there's almost like the other show you didn't do with all the works you didn't include for one reason or another. So, you know, every time I walk in, I think, oh, that would have made a really great pairing. But that's inevitably the process when you do a group show.
Yeah. I mean, so much of the skill of curation and what can really make or break a show is how the different pieces have been kind of placed in relationship to each other and the kind of constellations you see in your mind and the way that you're able to realize that in the gallery space. I wonder what were the kind of different components that you decided to divide the show up into to create those alliances?
Yeah, that's always the sort of, it's almost like, you know, composing a musical score because you're looking for a certain rhythm. You never want to overwhelm your audience. You want to take them basically on a journey with you. And one thing I knew from the start is I wanted to have that sort of smaller room, very much about the abstract body. That for me was a very clear grouping from the very beginning. Like I was choosing works with the knowledge they would go in that room, but the other rooms actually took form much later on. And it was only this summer when I got my dad, who's trained as an architect, who built me a sort of model of the space. And I sat there and I had all my mini artworks that I made for myself. And it's basically like going back to being a child and playing with a doll's house. You're just doing it with all your works. And I find that exercise really helpful because suddenly you're like in the space and you're starting to choreograph those constellations and you're seeing the relationships. And that for me was, for instance, a moment where the last room, which is very monochromatic, came together because I realized I had this whole, unconsciously, I had been collecting all of these works that were very monochromatic and they all made sense. They all spoke to each other. So again, it's almost like a process that you don't have from the very get-go an idea. You sort of find it as you come closer to the show, and a lot of decisions you make once you actually have the works in the space and you install them.
And were there any like obstacles along the way or things that you were kind of struggling to figure out, or did it all kind of happen very organically?
This one, I must say, happened very organically. It wasn't one that came with major problems. I mean, there are certain shows that come with big problems, and this one was one where it just somehow naturally all came together. It made sense. And you know, I would be lying if I said to you, the moment I started working on this, I had very clear in mind, like there was going to be a whole idea about labor and making. I kind of discovered these things as I read more and more about the artists, and I started tracing all of these like invisible lines between them. Many of them worked in isolation.
That was one of my questions for you, actually, when I was thinking about, I'm looking at the catalog and reading these brilliant little like précis that you've compiled of their lives and thinking, how is it possible that, sorry, I can't remember the name of the Polish woman who did the kind of, it looks like a teardrop almost. Is she Polish?
Maria Bartusowa.
Okay, so, you know, that work reminded me of some of Eva Hesse's work. And I'm thinking, like, how is this happening? Is it just like this is what sculptors do? They're exploring form, they're exploring gravity. Is that just what happens when you're working with volumes? Or, you know, I don't know. I love that part.
I mean, I love that part too, and I don't have an answer to it. And I guess that's the reason why it keeps being fascinating, because you're right, on a formal level, there's so many similarities between works that were done in such different contexts. I mean, the example of the Bartusowa hanging drop and the Eva Hesse sort of like hanging chords coming out of her works. It's all about gravity. And, you know, Bartusowa actually coined the term. She said gravistimulation. So basically she would fill these balloons with plaster and then have them hanging. And ultimately it was gravity that would determine the shape of the work. But clearly they didn't even know of each other's existence. There was no way. But I think it's a sort of like, I like to think there's a sort of shared sensibility towards where sculpture can take you, but it's also about, both her and Hesse are experimenting in very sort of non-traditional forms and materials. Like and I find this applies to a lot of the artists in the show, they are very much moved by the idea of like trying things out. With odd materials, with like, you know, Bartusova, her stuff was hanging from the trees in her garden. I mean, it's amazing, it's incredible. But it's also making use of what you have. And I think also Eva Hesse, especially, you know, she collected things when she was working in Germany. She was picking up the things she found in the factory where she was working. There's this feeling almost of like this, using the conditions of where you live, how you live, but also the sort of picking up junk culture. There's a lot of junk in the show. It's hidden, but there's a lot of junk.
Junk transformed. Yeah, I mean, so Hesse is a great example of someone who is working with like brand new materials that no one, you know, well, not no one, but other people were starting to work with them as well, going down to Canal Street and kind of cruising all those kind of industrial shops and seeing what kind of like interesting textural stuff she could get her hands on and take back to the studio. Something that you write about in your catalog essay is plastic and like the possibilities that plastic offered these artists. I mean, we today tend to think of plastic as like kind of like like stuff from China that we want to try not to buy because we don't want to throw too many things away and things we don't value very highly. But plastic in this show has a very different kind of significance.
Yes, and I think it has a significance that's very specific to that time. As you say, today the word plastic immediately is sort of surrounded with negative connotations, whereas in the 1960s, plastics was all the rage. It was exciting, it was new, it was, you know, the way I write about it and think about it, it's completely unencumbered. It's like a material, as you say, so many artists in New York went to Canal Street, or in the show there's an artist who's based in Paris, Marta Pan, who had this idea of like creating all of these plexiglass objects that in her mind could be sold in like, could be reproduced in like dozens and dozens and dozens of objects that would make art so much more accessible to people because, you know, manufacturing them industrially meant they weren't going to be unique pieces of art. For others, it was a surface. So plastic sort of like excited. It's that same spirit that I was describing before, that idea of experimentation. But plastic had the added value that unlike bronze and marble, and I think that's something to be said here, and I'm going to make a small parenthesis. When you think about sculpture, you need to think that women are confronting a tradition that's always been very heavily weighed towards men. Because to be a sculptor, you need to have certain conditions in terms of like the very space where you're working, the materials, the assistants. That was more challenging for women historically to access than, let's say, painting, which always also came with its challenges, but sculpture even more. So because this show is so much about sculpture in all its many different forms, it was important for me to like touch on what I felt was a moment where women seized the opportunity offered by a material that didn't come with that whole macho legacy of culture, that was entirely new, that was up for grabs, that spoke to the very contemporary moment. And some were thinking about legacy, many were not. I mean, today we know how hard it is to preserve plastic. But for them, it was like the material of the now.
Yeah. There's something in French, you know, my adopted land and language, you talk about les arts plastiques, like the visual arts are thought of as something plastic and pliable and moldable. And I think I like to read that kind of linguistic heritage into this idea of, you know, plastic offering all of these amazing opportunities to make new things. But I'm really struck by, you know, because I know we've been talking about Eva Hesse a lot, I'm sorry, I'm just obsessed with her. But as a, you know, her work is very unstable and as we were saying in the gallery, doesn't travel very often or at all because there's a real kind of concern that it might like literally come apart on the voyage. But this piece that you have with the long strands came from Tate, so I guess it's, you know, didn't come too far.
No, it's a short journey.
Yeah, just like a little train ride. a very careful train ride.
It also comes in an amazing box.
Oh,
I
I'm
must
sure.
say.
Yeah,
Like it's
I can
incredible, the
imagine.
box.
Yeah.
It's the kind of thing you cannot show, but like gets really excited when you open it, and it has like every string has its own like specific
Yeah.
little thing that holds it up. Like it's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a real
Precious.
sort of
Yeah.
labor of engineering.
Yeah. But then a kind of counterpoint to that I wasn't aware of while we were going through the show. This was it Sue Fuller, the American woman with the, oh God, please tell us about that piece because I can't do it justice.
Yeah, Sue Fuller, so it's a piece that you find in the room where you have the Louise Nevelson, which is that large gilded construction. And Sue Fuller is one of those artists that I've been obsessed since I saw, someone showed me her work a few years ago, and then there was a whole booth at Frieze Masses the year before last. And Sue Fuller was one of those people completely under the radar, but very consistent and persistent. And she believed, again, in the power of plastics, but especially she was very interested in making these works that create this almost optical effect using these very taut strings. Now, her biggest concern was, and she was like a perfectionist, was to find the best possible string. And she used to buy initially strings from hardware stores, fishing rods. Wasn't so convinced that they were going to be the one that was going to make the cut. So eventually patented her own strings and was recognized as a pioneer of plastics in art in America. And they sort of took her on tour to both America and, surprisingly, Eastern Europe on these like conferences around plastics. So she was giving like keynote speeches and was presented as almost like a scientist. And always thought of herself as very much someone sort of like brokering that divide between art and technology. Which also it's, why didn't we hear and see more of Sue Fuller?
Yeah, well, maybe we will be hearing
I mean, I
more
hope so.
going forward. But that piece is just so intricate, and I don't know, that it's like copper. The string looks like
It's
it's
the effect, and the fact that she made it in 1957, and in 2023, there's not one single string that's not perfectly taut. I mean, she was a genius.
Yeah, really. So one of the quite like a present through line in the show is the notion of the line itself. So I wonder if we could talk a bit about line for a bit, if that's not too wonky.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
wonky. I
Talk
love
about
the
wonky
use
lines.
of wonky lines. So the line, and the line is the unit. It basically you could walk around that show and see lines everywhere.
Yeah.
Apart from a few works which used dots. So there's a few people who stray away from the line, but the line is very present. And for me, the line was two things. It was something very material and present in the physicality of the works, but it was also this idea when I decided to call the show Lines of Abstraction, it was also thinking about the idea of lines as constellation, invisible lines tying together the artist. But also, I love that there's so many, when you start looking, and that becomes very apparent when you walk through the sort of like more corridor-like space where I'm bringing together lots of different lines. So you have the Carmen Herrera perfect lines.
Yeah.
And she said she never encountered a line she didn't like. She loved lines. And they're perfect. You can really tell she has a background in architecture to the millimeter. But then you sort of like, move quickly through that space, and you'll see that there's so many variations on the idea of the line, and there's no such thing as a perfect line. I think is what ultimately I was getting at, is lines are both like a pointer, but they're also like a metaphor for so many different things. They're forms of expression. And I like that, they go in all sorts of directions.
What is the wonkiest line in the show?
I think it's probably Arpita Singh, whose lines are really out of control, very convoluted. They're these small works. They're almost like automatic drawings that she did in the early 1970s. And it was a brief, Arpita Singh is an artist very well known in India, known mostly for her figurative work. And then she had this moment almost like a palette cleanser moment where she just made abstraction. And I think she made many of these drawings where she was almost letting, and you can tell just by looking at how densely packed those lines are, she was letting the line just flow freely.
They look kind of frantic to me.
Yeah,
It almost looks like a page from like I don't know, a kind of manuscript or something. Like there's some kind of story being told in those lines.
They do feel a bit calligraphic.
Yeah, that's probably what I was going for. So the thing that I probably one of the reasons that I'm here talking to you about this stuff, I'm not like a great expert in like formalist sculpture and line. I'm just really a big fan. Is the female component, the fact that they're all women in the show, and we were talking beforehand about the decision not to put women in the title, the fact that Barbara Hepworth, for instance, who's front and center right as you walk in, did not want her work to be shown in group shows that were only featuring women. Why not put the word women in the title? I happen to agree with you, but I'm interested to hear your reasoning for it.
So the word women was in the first title, and then the more I thought about it, and the more, there's two things. One, decades of exhibition making saw exhibitions just about men, and no one felt the need to say men in the title.
Yeah. It's just art and artists.
Art and artists.
Yeah.
The artist, and that's part of the issue we have today, is by default. I mean, I don't mean everyone. I'm sure everyone in this room shares my thinking that, we think of artists beyond gender, but, it kind of created a sense amongst, historically, a lot of people that associated the idea of an artist with a male artist, full stop. And so that was the starting point. It was like, well, tough luck. Decades of shows just, with no men in the title, then why shouldn't we do the same? And these happen to be women. And I wanted, perhaps people to walk in without knowing and just looking at the work on its own terms and the story it was telling. But also, I feel slightly guilty, and this brings us back to Barbara Hepworth, who would hate that she's in the show just with women. She righteously so said, I am an artist, full stop, and I'm an artist, and I completely agree with that stance. What I felt was a good compromise was bringing us back to what I was telling you earlier. It was about questioning the idea of abstraction from that specific perspective that justify the fact that it's just women coming together, but not putting the emphasis on that. So many shows, which I think are still necessary to sort of bring women, especially historically, women into that canon of art history that has excluded them, still have the word women. All the recent shows still have the word women, left and right. And so I felt it was important to say, yes, I'm still doing a show that does have just women, but it's trying to move away from this idea of like seeing women artists as a category of themselves, because that's not true.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I made the decision in my last book to write about feminist artists rather than women artists or female artists, because I, first of all, wanted to be inclusive and not just be talking about cis women, but also to think about just like the politics of the work, not necessarily an intentional politics of the work. I did an event the other night with a French author who was saying, I want my work to be kind of pure of all politics. There's no politics there. And I'm sitting there going, okay, but I kind of disagree with, Anyway,
Did you say that to her?
No, I didn't know. I had to be very respectful of her stature in French literature. And anyway, it was a very complicated moment for me because I disagreed but couldn't say it. But I think, there's something political and social in material. It's not like because Louise Bourgeois makes this very kind of crusty, weird Avenza that there isn't a kind of political unconscious to it.
And I think that is basically, you're touching on what is really the story behind a lot of this. I mean, And that's why I said at the very beginning, for me, it was important, that sort of proto-feminist moment. A lot of the artists in this show, I think if they were alive today and they heard me say that they were, I was like sort of shoehorning them into the idea of proto-feminism, would say no. But I actually think there's a lot of like, there's a lot of that unconscious political element in the use of the material, in the labor, in the kind of, the way they conceive of their work, and they thought about it and they developed it. That might be completely like, you know, yes, completely unconscious, but it's there.
Yeah.
And it's about the moment in time in which they're working.
Exactly. I mean, there's a feminist gesture in sitting at your table and like stapling aluminum foil, or, you know, Louise Bourgeois. Sorry, I've just translated the biography of Louise Bourgeois. It's coming out next year, so I've got her on the brain. But she used to like sit at the kitchen table and whittle, you know, she's making her weird little personnage sculptures, and her sons have these, you know, distinct memories of maman at the table with her knife, like not, you know, cutting their food for them, but like cutting her little...
Well, it's like Rufus Awa making her incredible, like, you know, woven hanging sculptures with wire, you know, in the space of her home, and her children, her 6 children, living with them and being part of it, which, you know, made her a housewife artist, according to Life magazine.
Right.
We all disagree with this, clearly. But, you know, that is part of the work.
Yeah. There's a great book by Kate Briggs called This Little Art. Do you know it?
No.
It's Fitzcarraldo, and it's about translation, and it's about like housewife translators, basically, women who had families and maybe didn't have the time to be writing these magnum opus, what's the plural of magnum opus? But they did have time to translate, and I think about this a lot in my own life and work, because I have a 5-year-old, and so when he's around, not a lot of work can really, like work, you know, like serious books can happen. But like a couple of years ago, I translated a book during the summer while I was watching him, because it was a very short book. It's coming out in May. By Kolom Schneck is the name of the artist. It's about her abortion that she had when she was 17. And so I'm just, you know, like thinking about the weirdness of like watching this child while translating a book about abortion. But like that kind of housewifely work that's what Kate Briggs writes about as a little art, as kind of insignificant or decorative, or not, you know, the major work, but the thing next door. That's what I think of, you know, whenever I deal with Rufus Awa's work, I'm thinking about it through the lens of littleness, but it's actually,
And, you know, a lot of these women would be cast in that way. Yuko Nazaka, who is using drills and making, you know, part and parcel of the Gutai group, and her work is, again, in the last room where you have the hanging piece. It was like physically, you know, quite intense work, but she was always, even though she was part of the Gutai group, showing with Gutai, with all the men, inevitably, the way she was framed and the way the work was framed was, again, in this sort of like weird hybrid space between housewife has a weird hobby with a drill. And, you know, there's a piece in a Japanese magazine, which I think is the equivalent of Life magazine, in which basically she's beautifully dressed in this suit, and, you know, the journalist is making this really odious comment saying one cannot quite understand how her husband will allow her to do this kind of work. And, you know, a woman dressed so well should not be toying around with a drill and making holes.
Yeah.
And, you know, everything that was sort of elevated and glorified that her male peers were doing was suddenly like, you know, your little work, precisely what you just said, is not okay. Or if it's happening, we need to like frame it in like, oh, look at this quirky woman with a drill.
Exactly.
Let's not take her seriously.
Yeah, exactly. There's a really interesting moment in the catalog essay. I'm going to quote it. You write, "Now women are part of the narrative, but how we see and read their work remains all too often clouded by the specter of relationality, with men being both opposite and counterpart. Like we can't talk about their work without somehow defining it through the men around them." And one of my concerns in Art Monsters was to try to throw off this obligation of relationality and not to see feminist work as necessarily in reaction against patriarchy, but to see if, I think Judy Chicago somewhere writes, like, what kind of work is ours? I wanted to know what our work would look like if we weren't trying to rebel against anything or thought of as rebelling. I wonder how you see this show as trying to escape that kind of obligation of relation.
I mean, that's a really good question, and inevitably it's one of those questions that you're constantly confronted, very often because many of these women were married
Right.
to male artists. Although I would say that in this case, maybe it's only a 30%. It's a hard thing because you don't want to always make it sound as if the women are their work only ever exists as this like oppositional kind of work.
Right.
It exists in its own right with its own concerns. And that for me was really important to think of what those concerns were as opposed to how they related vis-a-vis to those of the men. For instance, last year when I was developing the show, I went to see the Abstraction show that was at the Whitechapel. And I felt, a lot of the rhetoric there was like this idea of gestural abstraction being people like Pollock, and then, you kind of have the women batting off Pollock left and right. When I think we need to almost forget there's Pollock and just think about what it is. And this brings us back to this sort of proto-feminism. What is the condition of the making of that work that justifies its existence, and what are its concerns? And I felt that there was a lot that really stood on its own grounds. I didn't have this, it was a concern, but I didn't feel like I had too much of it as I was thinking through the different works.
Yeah. I'm thinking about Hannah Wilkie, for instance, who's also someone that I wrote about in Art Monsters, because I love that she, the works that you've chosen to include in this show are very early, and I would love to hear you talk about them a bit. One of the things that I love about her work and the way that she spoke about it was that she was interested, she wasn't trying to, if you know her work at all, she made like a lot of little ceramic vulvas, or at least that's how we see them now, but they weren't made to be vulvas. They were made because she was a sculptor by training and she was interested in gesture, and she just took a piece of clay and went like that. And then entered into this kind of serial practice where she was making a lot of little gestures like that. And one day someone was like, haha, that kind of looks like a vulva. And she's like, oh yeah, you're right, okay. And then she kind of embraced that, and then that took her on a whole kind of, like area of her practice, but they weren't à la base, like originally meant to be vulvae. So I wonder how you're thinking about Wilkie in relationship to this show, and that kind of relationship between abstraction and figuration.
I mean, she's a really good example of something that, as I said, became its own theme very quickly. And it was this idea of the body. And the body, for those familiar with feminist art, a lot of feminist artists use their own bodies, for performances, as a way of reclaiming, a gaze that's separate from the male gaze, reclaiming the body from objectification. So it's like it's very present as a form of art making, and specifically a form of feminist art making. But here I was interested almost in that sort of clumsy getting to that point where abstraction is a bit about the body, and there's a bit of figuration that's sort of like kicking in, but it's still like very much not fully formed as a language. And that Wilke piece, and I fought to have that specific piece. It was one that, I actively wanted that one piece. It's a very early piece, and it's 5 ceramic pieces. They're more or less this size each, and they're 5 vulvae. But when you look at it, unless you're told what it is, it could also be 5 very abstract things with 5 very different shapes, all made by hand. They're also, they're a bit clunky. One of them can't quite stand. We had to prop it up with some museum wax because it was going to collapse. So there's something about them that they're very, you can really feel the making of them, and almost like then the meaning coming afterwards. But that's precisely what I was interested in. It's that funny connection where, what is the intention? Was it the body all along, or was it just the exercise of making those shapes? And I think that applies to basically a lot of those works in that space, where the body is there, but almost unexpectedly, unwillingly, or where it's deliberate, it's still like timid.
Yeah.
It's a body that's still shy.
I love that. I'm so glad you had that early Wilkie pieces. Well, piece. I don't know if do they form one piece?
Yeah,
or are they just
they're
great
one
pieces?
piece, and they
Okay.
actually come they have a very
Yeah.
specific configuration that we had to
Interesting.
follow. Yeah, these are the quirky curatorial details.
I love it. I love it. I think this is probably a good point to open things out. If there are questions out in the room, don't be shy.